definitely, definitely had it. Well, it's a good segue into what we're reading today, which is Zechariah and the chapter that we're on right now, chapter 11. Last week, when we finished with chapter 10, he was kind of railing against these other countries that are going to be punished and that the people will be brought back. It was kind of a scary text for them. The Nile will dry up, down will come the pride of Assyria, the scepter of Egypt will pass away, and Judah and Ephraim will become mighty. So all of our enemies, all of the countries around us are going to go down and we're going to go up. That's a kind of like, we're towards the end of Zechariah. So like we had with some of the other prophets, like Jeremiah and Isaiah, you think, well, we're kind of coming to the end. We're getting to the good part where we're going to get good things happen. Yeah, except for chapter 11 is wedged between two good chapters, but chapter 11 is it's puzzling because it doesn't fit the flow of what we're in, and it doesn't even fit the flow of what we've seen from the other prophets. We've seen negative prophecies, but not usually in the midst of the positive prophecies. So it's a real interesting question, like what happens here? And so some people have speculated that there was like a problem that Zechariah was dealing with, that the prophets Haggai and these prophets during the building of the second temple, there was a problem. They hit a wall, they hit a snag, they hit people becoming frustrated and going backwards. We don't really know. But we do know that this is pretty negative. This is not, you don't want to hear this from your prophet who you think is now giving you good information, good stuff. That's not the case. And it begins, there's kind of two things that happen here. The first part is also not positive, but it's not really the negative stuff that we hear later. But this is kind of like an ecological destruction, a nightmare, if you will, for what happens to the environment. So Rosemary, who's live and in person in our midst. Rosemary, would you start for us?
Throw open your gates, O Lebanon, and let fire consume your cedars. Howl, cypresses, for cedars have fallen. How the mighty are ravaged. Howl, you oaks of Bashan, for the stately forest is laid low.
Yeah, that's kind of the destruction of trees. Destruction of trees sounds like something we worry about. There's more.
Hark, the wailing of the shepherds, for their rich pastures are ravaged. Hark, the roaring of the great beast, for the jungle of the Jordan is ravaged.
Yeah. Can everyone hear Rosemary pretty well? Because she's got a mic. You can hear her, right? Yes? People out there? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, you can hear her good?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Elise. Yeah, so Rosemary was reading about trees in the first part, and now we're reading about pasture land where shepherds would be. And here's a weird phrase, the jungle of the Jordan. The jungle, that's the way they translated it. May not be the way that, yeah, it's a alliterative jungle of the Jordan. Mary, what does yours say? The pride of the Jordan. Yeah, they translated the word Gaon as that. So I don't think it had to be. I don't think it had to be jungle. I think they were trying to be alliterative, and it didn't have to be alliterative because the word Gaon Yarden is not alliterative in Hebrew. So I'm not really sure, but it does seem to be more than. It seems to be more than just a pride. The word Gaon can be a pride, like something that you're proud of. But there is another reading of this, which it is a forest, or and it seems as though, well, first of all, I know the King James also translated Phirim as not great beast. What did it translate it as? Instead of great beast, what does it say? The roaring of, yeah. Kfir is a lion cub. So this is just another example of them kind of like trying to capture the meaning of it rather than the literal translation. Because the kol shagat kfirim is the sounds of roaring of lions, which, I mean, hello. I mean, most of the time when you hear a roar, it's going to be attached to a lion. So that's not really, wasn't also really necessary. But clearly what they set up in the image of this is a forest, a rainforest with like panthers and beasts like crawling along the like in the trees almost. That's not what this was. So I don't really know what they did. We do know from the geologic, work that we've done in the Jordan River that at that time there was more life in the Jordan Valley, that there really was green foresty areas around the Jordan. Okay, so it's not impossible that there was forest there or that there was more life there, but that there's a jungle there, it's kind of weird. And it isn't really like, that's not really shouldn't really be the translation. So I think they went a little crazy. But the idea that it was more green, that there's animals living there, that animals live in that area, that's more of what it is. And that is true. That's what it looked like. But the point is,
What's she doing?
the forests are being ravaged too.
Everything.
Everything is being ravaged. So it is a ecological disaster from the forests, from the pasture land. All of this is being destroyed. So this is not good. This is not a good situation. Now we get this strange and very negative allegory of Zechariah. So let's read from verse 4.
Thus said my God, the Eternal One, tend the sheep meant for slaughter, whose buyers will slaughter them with impunity, whose seller will say, praised be God, I'll get rich, and whose shepherd will not pity them. For I will pity the inhabitants of the land no more, declares God, but I will place everyone at the mercy of their neighbor and at the mercy of their king. They shall break the country to bits, and I will not rescue it from their hands.
Yeah, this is like gone back to what it was like before the temple was destroyed. That they're gonna be like, you're like the shepherd, and I'm gonna take all your sheep away. Yeah, and it's pretty clear that what this allegory is meant to represent, that the people of the country, the Israelites, the Jews, the people living in Judea are going to be hurt again. Yeah.
So I tended the sheep meant for slaughter, for those poor ones of the sheep. I got 2 staffs, one of which I named Favor and the other Unity, and I proceeded to tend the sheep. But I lost the 3 shepherds in 1 month. Then my patience with them was at an end, and they, in turn, were disgusted with me.
Now, we're not really sure who these 3 shepherds are. Again, it could also be read a third of the flock. I have a feeling, though, the King James probably uses the word 3 shepherds, right? So we don't know who these 3 shepherds are. People have, tried to find prophetic interpretations of this. These are 3 kings, or these are 3, different rulers or 3 controllers who are going to work for the Persians. We just don't know. Or these are 3 people that are sent by the Persians. We don't know. We don't know. It doesn't say. this is kind of a mystery. Some people say, and I think it's possible, that the three shepherds might represent the priests, the Levites, and the prophets. The people who are supposed to be tending the sheep. I mean, you could say priests, Levites, and the kings, but there are no kings anymore. Priests, kings, and Levites. I mean, could have been John. Don't blame John. He wasn't. But the people who, well, look, Christian scholars will say that this represents something from Jesus's time, because again, a lot of the imagery of Jesus is as a shepherd, obviously, right? They call him the good shepherd, or the shepherd. So there's a lot of Christian reading of this section, and you'll see why in a second. So God isn't happy with the shepherds. That's what it says. Or the shepherds don't do their job. They're bad. Zechariah doesn't like them, but they're bad. They're bad shepherds.
I was listening to the Altman translation yesterday, and they translated the staffs, I think, as pleasant and bruising.
That's weird. That's a weird translation. There are different.
Wait, did she say pleasant and bruising?
Bruising.
Bruising,
Yeah.
yes.
These two staffs, obviously, we'll get to it because we're going to see what happens to these staffs. Also are a source of speculation of what these represent, and who they represent, or maybe they represent, the two temple. I mean, there's different theories about what these staffs represent, and therefore, again, what they mean, or how they translate it. How does King James translate them? Bands. So they're using, like, they're being brought together, that they're banded together, like wrapped around each other, like connected by being banded, by being wrapped together. I mean, Neum usually, and this is, again, the name of the staff and why they capitalize it is Noam, which is actually a common Hebrew name today, Noam, a much more common Hebrew name than when I was a kid, common in Israel, so to speak. It usually means pleasant or favor, or it has that connotation, but it's something like good. And the other one does have kind of, you'll assume that the connotation is unity, or something being brought together, or being connected, being unified. So here's what happens. Well, we will get to the staffs, but you'll see what happens and why people have interpreted these, or tried to interpret these in different ways. Okay.
So I declared, I am not going to tend you. Let the one that is to die, die. And the one that is to get lost. And let the rest devour each other's flesh.
Which is not something that sheep normally do. But he's basically saying, I don't care anymore. Whatever happens to the sheep, they're done. And whatever happens, I don't care. It's not my responsibility anymore. They're done. They're just not working out. I can't take care of these sheep. So whatever happens, happens. If they're supposed to die, they're going to die. So here's what happens to the staffs.
Taking my staff favor, I cleft it in two, so as to annul the covenant I had made with all the peoples. And when it was annulled that day, the same poor ones of the sheep who watched me realized that it was a message from God.
Yeah, so the first staff, he cuts it in two and says, this is over. So favor, it's over. It's done. And again, where it says here, the peoples, well, there's a prediction coming up later, but chapter 14, but the point is that, people are in a covenant. They're in a covenant with God, but the covenant's been broken. It's over. Again, this is really, really bad. I mean, this is bad news. And anyways, the people take note of that. Look at this.
Then I said to them, if you are satisfied, pay me my wages. If not, don't. So they weighed out my wages, 30 shekels of silver. the noble sum that I was worth in their estimation. God said to me, just deposit it in the treasury. And I took the 30 shekels and deposited it in the treasury in the house of God.
Yeah. So a lot of people just made noise in here when they read
Right.
the 30 shekels of silver. Why did you make noise when you heard it, Sheldon? What did you see? What did,
Because that's how Jesus was sold out for 30 shekels.
yeah. So Judas in the Christian Bible betrays Jesus for 30 shekels. Okay, but that's not the first time we've seen 30 shekels. 30 shekels is the price of a slave, right? That's the price of a slave for a life of a slave. You can buy a slave for 30 shekels. So the fact that Jesus is sold for 30 shekels, or
Betrayed.
betrayed, understand that,
It's
It's
an insult added to injury.
yeah. So if we look at what if we look at this,
Not only did they sell him out, they sold him out cheap.
yes. However, Joseph, based on inflation over the last 1,000 years, Joseph got sold for 20
Right.
shekels of silver. But the
But he
point-
was younger too.
yeah, maybe, but you could argue that he was worth more. But yeah, so 30 shekels is, as you can imagine, symbolic. And of course, this story is happening, 400 years, 450 years before Jesus, or I guess 450 years before, or 500 years or so before he was born. But yes, the Jesus story to some extent is based on this, as we talked about before, these passages from Zechariah, including the one we read last week about riding on a donkey. So these passages, again, were there for hundreds of years. People knew that, when Zechariah says he's worth 30 shekels of silver, and that's a lot of money, what happens, of course, with that money is he doesn't get it. Now, again, this whole part of Jeremiah,
Outside.
right, is when it starts in verse 4. I mean, the whole thing is an allegory, right? It doesn't say it's a dream, but clearly there's something going on here which isn't like, it can't be taken literally. I mean, we know that these staves represent something. We know that the sheep represent something. We know that in this story, the shepherds, of which he's one of them, he's like the overseer of the shepherds, they represent something. So all of these things represent things in here, but he takes the money and he puts it into the treasury, which is interesting because he doesn't keep it. He doesn't say, well, it's mine now. He puts it in the treasury. He puts it into the temple, which at the time was like nothing. It's like being built. So there's an interesting thing in the back of your mind. So what are they doing with this money? They put it into the treasury, the house of God. Yeah.
Is this text oral? What's the evidence of this text
Being written?
Or
So
right, we talked 520.
yeah, so most likely the prophecies that were there were probably written down, like starting from the time of Isaiah, which is 700s.
BC.
Yeah, this is 200 years later, right? That these were probably written down not long after they were written. They were said. So how long they were oral, probably not. That's not the issue of like, did people tell this orally and then write it down? We believe that probably around 800 BC was when we started writing down the stories. So where it really comes into issue is Genesis, right? So the stories, let's say about Abraham or Joseph, were those stories, because they're set essentially 1300, 1500 BC. They're set about 700 years before they would have been written down. Those stories would have been oral for generations before they were written down. So were the stories of Moses written down hundreds of years later? Yeah, probably 400 or 500 years later. But the stories of the kings, some of those would have been written, like the last kings we read about, like Josiah and those kings, they could have been written. And again, we don't believe they didn't write anything down. I mean, I believe that probably starting around 1000, there was some stuff written down, because that's when you get the stories of David. And I believe those were written down pretty close to when he lived. I don't believe those were oral stories at all, actually.
My point is that if these have been written down 600 years before 1 CE,
Yeah.
right? Not heresy. That means people have been reading these things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the actors, right, and that's meant in a legal term, not a
Yeah.
facetious term. In 1 CE, 2 CE, 50 BC,
Yeah.
whatever. They're reading this.
Yeah.
And they're planning it out.
Yeah.
And so these actors are they're filling these roles.
Yes. 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 It's very clear that they have the text. They have the text. And one of the ways we know they have the text is when they quote something verbatim, or when they use the exact same words that are in the text, we know they had the text. Because, I mean, yes, it's possible that something is orally transmitted and people quote it exactly the way it is, but more likely they read it.
My point is, that if I see something that's written 150 years ago, and I start acting out as
Yeah.
that, does that make me the person that text was writing about 100 years earlier?
Look, you have to understand that the interesting thing is, you could add to that, is that the more it was disseminated, the more that it was written down, the more you would assume that if the text is written down, then it can be spread around easier. Somebody takes it from one place to the other. They have a copy of it. Somebody reads it. Somebody didn't read it for the last 30 years, but they now read it again. So, you know, if it's orally transmitted, if somebody stops telling the story, or if that group gets killed, there's no one to tell the story anymore, the story ends. The story doesn't end once it's written down. So you can have a transmission, or it becomes relevant again, where people start reading it again and go, oh, you know what, let's read this again. And so, yeah, once it's written down, it is now kind of out of your control as far as how this is going to get spread. And again, people are very familiar with it. So there's no question that by the time, like, Jesus runs, if he does ride a donkey, everybody knows what he's doing when he rides a donkey. I don't know that he did, by the way. I'm not 100% sure that he did that. But if he did it, everybody knew what he was doing when he did that. So
Not just that scene, but then did Islam miss the memo? Did Hindu miss the memo?
no. Everybody
How did it not get to-
everybody who has that story written down now, you could make the argument, has access to it once we know that it's written down. Absolutely. Once it's written down and we know that it's written down, then we have, again, the problem is, can we verifiably say, hey, we have a copy that's 2,600 years old? We don't, but we have to make those we get that from the language, the text, and we get it from, so if we see words there that are clearly from that period, then we know, hey, that wasn't written 500 years later. And the other thing is, if there's a lack of awareness for something that happens, then we go, well, that guy clearly didn't know that had happened yet, right? So if somebody writes about, for example, in the Christian Bible, when somebody writes about the temple is standing in Jerusalem, that means that text was written before 70. If the temple was destroyed and the person talks about the temple being destroyed, we know that text was written after 70. So there's certain things that, like the clues, in the text, that give it away for when that was written. So again, no question, John, once it's written, it can be spread and people know the story a lot better. And Zechariah seems to have been a prophet that people knew. And I think he was pretty well known. Plus, as we said, it's 14 chapters, so it's one of the longer. It's actually the longest of the minor prophets, Zechariah. We're going to get to some of the lines that we still know. We don't talk about this line as much because we're not Christian, and we don't talk about the 30 pieces of. I mean, like when you read it, you're like, oh, and again, Christians have a way of interpreting it. It's saying, hey, that's what happens to Jesus. But people like the people at Jesus's time knew this story. They knew what Jeremiah had said. Okay, so they knew that this was there. All right, so let's read what then how this ends. And again, this is a really negative chapter. There's no question. This is not what we expected to find at the end of Zechariah. Okay.
Then I cleft into my second staff, unity, in order to annul the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. God said to me further, get yourself the gear of a foolish shepherd, for I am going to raise up in the land a shepherd who will neither miss the lost sheep, nor seek the strayed, nor heal the injured, nor sustain the frail, but will feast on the flesh of the fat ones and tear off their hoofs. Oh, the worthless shepherd who abandons his flock. Let a sword descend upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall shrivel up. His right eye shall go blind.
Yeah. So who's he talking about here? Well, clearly somebody who should have done the job better, right? Somebody who was a shepherd who should have been doing his job. And Zechariah is playing this guy out and making him, calling him out. And it's, he's not doing his job. Interestingly, by the way, within this text is a little secret that we should kind of know, especially when we want to understand why is this image of a shepherd, why is this such an important idea? And what do shepherds do? Look what shepherds do. They miss their lost sheep, right? Which makes them seek them, right? They want to find those that have gone away. They heal. A good shepherd does this, right? Heal the injured, sustains the frail. And again, look what this guy does. He feasts on the flesh of the fat ones. That's what the bad guy does. But the good guy, on the other hand, would have done those kinds of things for his sheep. So you can see what it is that a good shepherd would do and why that image is so important for us. When we say the Lord is my shepherd, right? When we use that in Psalm 23, where we talk about Moses being a shepherd or David being a shepherd, this is what we're trying to convey, that this is what a shepherd will do. Again, for those of us that aren't shepherds or don't even think about ever being a shepherd or don't know a shepherd, these are the kinds of things that a shepherd is supposed to do. So again, some of them are obvious, taking care of the sheep, making sure they don't wander off, but it's also healing them, right? Trying to take care of them when they're sick.
Sheep are surprisingly fragile.
Yeah. Yeah.
Domestic sheep, that is.
So you got to take care of them, and you have to take care of their feet or their legs when they get hurt, and you have to, yeah. So this is really negative. These 17 verses are really bad. And again, there's a curse on that bad shepherd. Again, we talk about, people losing their arm, like in when we say in Psalm in Psalm 136, we say, let my right arm lose its cunning, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. These are like curses that you put on somebody. You lose the strength of your arm, and here's your right eye. Here's the eyes are brought into it. So yeah, this is a curse for the bad people. Now, the good news is that's over. The last couple of chapters are not negative. They're not going to be of that kind of that tone, which was really, really like, where did that even come from? Chapter 10 wasn't like that. Chapter 12 is not like that. Let's read a little bit nicer stuff. That'd be nice.
A pronouncement, the word of God concerning Israel. the utterance of God, who stretched out the skies and made firm the earth and created mortals' breath within them. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a bowl of reeling for the peoples all around. Judah shall be caught up in a siege upon Jerusalem, when all the nations of the earth gather against her. In that day I will make Jerusalem a stone for all the peoples to lift. All who lift it shall injure themselves.
Yeah, so there's going to be another attack on Jerusalem. By the way, this was literally when I was reading this a couple of weeks ago, thinking about when we're going to get to this section. It sounded a little
Scary.
too scary. It sounded a little too relevant.
I was, as I said, listening to the Ultimate Translation last night. We're coming to some scary stuff.
Yeah, and it's a little too real. It's a little too real for me right now, because this idea that in their attack on us, that's how they're going to be brought down. And I don't know, when we read this a couple of weeks ago, it was a little closer to the Iranian attack on Israel. And I thought to myself, holy moly, this is exactly what's happening right now. So both physically and to some extent spiritually. So look what happens.
In that day, declares God, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness. But I will watch over the house of Judah while I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. And the clans of Judah will say to themselves, the dwellers of Jerusalem are a task set for us by their God, God of hosts.
So this is a phrase that we're going to see a lot in this last few chapters, the last 3 chapters of Zechariah. Bayom Hahu, on that day, right? Bayom Hahu, there it is there. There it is there. You'll see it a lot. We had it in some of the other prophecies. We had it in Joel. We had it, we've had it a little bit actually throughout, even going back to Isaiah. But this phrase, Bayom Hahu, in that day, is this kind of prophetic promise of there will be a day of reckoning. And for us, the day of reckoning is that our enemies are going to fail. They will fail, and we will benefit from their failure. So, first of all, by the way, I want to point out that the understanding, and again, even for Christian scholars who read this honestly, they say this was not meant to be 500 years later, 2,000 years later, 2,500 years later. It was supposed to be pretty soon after he says this, right? So again, the fact that like we read into it today, our modern situation, we've been doing that for 2,500 years. But there is something really interesting about this, which is not just that we're going to defeat our enemies, because that's the hope, right? That any enemy that we would have would be defeated. But here's the weird, again, why is it kind of relevant, is that it's almost based on the fact that they attack us, and when they attack us, that's how they go down, okay? Because when you think about it, like usually in a war, or I would guess, like the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Persians now who are living at this time, everybody else, when they go to war, they say, let our God help us conquer our enemies. We're going to conquer them and subdue them. We're going to roll over them, and we're going to conquer their land and take slaves and take their women and take their land and everything else. That's not what we have. And we're writing at the same time that they're writing. We have their writings, and we know what they say, and we know what they did. We have a different approach, which is that they will attack us, and when they attack us, that's when they're going to go down. So it's a different way of thinking about war, and it's a different way of thinking about how you're going to succeed. You succeed when they attack you and they lose.
It's the opposite of Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah. Yeah, there is no crom here. This is, you're attacking us and you will die by doing it. And I don't know, but I think that still affects our psychology. And I think it does affect what Israel does to some extent, because Israel very rarely engages in preemptive warfare. They did it in the 6-Day War, and they did it in Lebanon. And for the most part, every war that Israel's ever had has been reactionary to something else. And again, in both cases that I just mentioned, the 6-Day War and Lebanon, it wasn't like Israel wasn't provoked. But the argument of whether Israel had to go into Lebanon, that's definitely one that there are differences of opinion on that. And in the 6-Day War, yes, Israel was dealing with a blockade and was dealing with a definite situation where it did look like they were going to be attacked any moment. But again, Israel very rarely, in Israel's 76 years of history, very rarely has fought a war that was not provoked or, again, in response, what we call a reaction. So it is interesting that seems to be part of our psychology, which is let them attack. If they attack us, they'll fail. Again, it's a dangerous situation to put yourself in to some extent, but what happens? They're going to attack us and their riders and their horses. It's going to fail. They're going to be destroyed. It's going to fail. Right? So that's the first part of this.
In that day, I will make the clans of Judah like a flaming brazier among sticks, and like a flaming torch among sheaves. They shall devour all the besieging peoples right and left, and Jerusalem shall continue on its site in Jerusalem. God will give victory to the tents of Judah first, so that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not be too great for Judah.
Okay, so there seems to be a little rivalry between Jerusalem and the rest of Judah. Okay, I get it. That's the big city. You can understand that. But again, the important part about this is, again, the besieging people. The people are the besieging them. They're attacking us. They shall devour all the besieging peoples. So they come at us and then we defeat them. Okay, so that's what's happening. They attacked us and we defeated them.
In that day, God will shield the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the feeblest of them shall be in that day like David, and the house of David like a divine being, like an angel of God at their head.
Okay, so that's interesting because that's an allusion to actually David, right? So there's a line here that tells us again that David, King David, is referred to here as a hero and as somebody who our weak people are going to be like King David. So he was a great fighter, a great soldier, a great warrior. The feeblest is going to be like David. Okay, so they're going to be very, very tough. What's interesting here also is that the phrase Beit David, the house of David, is going to be like a divine being. Okay, so why is that interesting? Because the earliest references to David that we have outside of the Bible, the earliest ones that we can determine, for example, the stone that we found at Tel Dan, that is from 800 BCE, refers to Beit David, the house of David. So we refer to it as the house of David. We know that those references exist archaeologically, and here it is too. Now, the Tel Dan inscription is a little tough because it doesn't say David himself, but it says Beit David. It says the house of David. So it's pretty clear that it's the David. It's the same guy. But we use that phrase, the house of David. And here it is used here, the house of David. So it corresponds exactly to what we found archaeologically about the reference, how we reference it, And again, how other people might have referenced it as the house of David, the dynasty, that Davidic dynasty, Beit David. All right, and here's what it says specifically.
In that day, I will all but annihilate all the nations that came up against Jerusalem. But I will fill the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem with a spirit of pity and compassion, and they shall lament to me about those who are slain, wailing over them as over a favorite son, and showing bitter grief as over a firstborn.
Wow. So, it seems as though they're upset about the people that they killed. Now, it could be they're lamenting over those that were killed on their side in battle, but doesn't say that. It says they're going to have pity and compassion, which tells us that it's not what you'd expect. You'd expect people to mourn their own people, but it seems that they're being filled by God with a spirit of pity and compassion for those that they killed in battle. Not just those that died for defending the city, but for their own people, not for their own people, but for the people that they killed. And again, this is another phrase that begins in that day, right? By Yom Hahu. So again, they attacked us. They came against us. And we're upset about how many people we killed. Also, I think a little too relevant.
Yeah.
This is something that we really, really do think about, because every day that people die in Gaza, we talk about it, we lament it. We definitely don't celebrate it, but when another 30 people die in a bombing, we report about it. We don't just report on it in America, we report on it in Israel. And again, we lay those deaths at the feet of Hamas and say, this is a battle that you created, that you started.
From the ICC, they want to.
Yes, well, fortunately, the ICC has no power, but other than that,
How many divisions has the
has the ICC, that's right, how many divisions? But it's unnerving that, again, that they've like made this comparison. And again, even within Israel, for people who don't like Netanyahu, every single, like everybody rushed to. If you don't like Netanyahu, you should be very upset with the ICC, because all they did was make everybody in Israel just jump on Netanyahu's side. I mean, literally, they handed Netanyahu a favor. I understand. Okay, I get it. Well, I get it. But the point is that this was something that in Israel unites everybody behind Netanyahu. So everybody was upset by it. And just trust me, the people who hate Netanyahu are very pissed right now, because they know I mean, look, Biden said it too. I mean, everybody who rationally looks at it says, oh, okay, so let's see what happens the next time. Okay, let's see what happens the next time there's a war, right? Let's see the next time, is the next president who's responsible for responding to a 9/11 going to be held up to a ICC trial, or an ICC prosecution, I should say. It hasn't been a trial yet, but a prosecution. Are they going to write up a warrant for him? Because look, I mean, technically speaking, based on the parameters that they just laid out, George Bush could have been considered war criminal.
Kennedy, so could have
Yeah,
Johnson.
yeah.
So could
FDR.
People said those things at the time too.
FDR. What
Yeah.
are you talking about? They had the bomb.
Yep. So we'll see. Let's see the next time. Let's see the next time that there's a war. Let's see the next time that there's a response to terrorism. There wasn't, but that's the point, is if we use that same standard, right? Then everybody who's responded to war is, and again, it seems strange that again, this is what's happening to Israel. But again, what's interesting is if this is what we think it is, which is the fact that Jews are the 2,500 years ago, we are lamenting the deaths of the people who came and attacked us. That's what this seems to be saying. Okay. And now we have another Bayom Hahu.
In that day, the wailing in Jerusalem shall be as great as the wailing at Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. The land shall wail, each family by itself, the family of the house of David by themselves, and their women folk by themselves, the family of the house of Nathan by themselves, and their women folk by themselves, the family of the house of Levi by themselves, and their women folk by themselves, the family of the Shimeites by themselves, and their women folk by themselves, and all the other families, every family by itself, with their women folk by themselves.
So again, this phrase is strange, but you look at this note, it says, apparently it will prevail upon God to spare the remnant of the besieging nations. So it seems as though we're crying for the death of our invaders. The wailing in Jerusalem will be as great as the wailing of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo, which is again, probably Megiddo. It's a way of poetically mentioning Megiddo. But again, are these, it seems as though that we're weeping. And again, we're not sure, why does it say the house of David and then the house of Nathan? Is this the prophet Nathan that's mentioned in the story of David, the prophet that calls him out for Bathsheba is, yes, Nathan's in Coney Island. Does David also has a son named Natan? So is it him? Yeah. Is the Shimeites, or is this one of, again, Shimei is mentioned in the story of David, or is this going back to these houses that are of this time? Again, in some cases it says Mishpachat, the family, and in some cases it says Beit Natan, and this is Beit Levi, the Levites, but it doesn't say the Levites, it says the house of Levi. So again, it's a strange phrase in the sense that it seems to be more poetic than it does necessarily literal, but the idea that people are weeping for not just their families, or people that died fighting, but the people who came and tried to kill us. So it's a very strange, I mean, that's what we understand it as. We understand it that it is us crying for the people who came to attack us. So that chapter is, well, I will say that the next chapter, there's a break that you can make here because there's another Bayom Hahu, but there's Bayom Hahus all throughout here. So any of these that begin Bayom Hahu could be the beginning of another prophecy, if you will. On this day, this shall happen. On this day, this shall happen. The next one kind of goes into a different theme than this. This seems to be all about this battle that happens, and it starts, here, the beginning of chapter 12. This next chapter, chapter 13, is interesting because it kind of goes back to some of the things that we read about in Ezekiel in particular, some of the imagery that we have, but it's also an interesting kind of, well, it's definitely positive, but it's another one that has some interesting things that we think about today. But again, it begins with Bayom Hahu.
In that day, a fountain shall be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem for purging and lustration.
Yeah, let's just see. This note here just says, what they're saying is that they took out the words that actually are there, which Mary, the King James says. Yeah, so that a fountain is going to open up in Jerusalem that'll allow people to essentially go to the mikveh and be purged of their sins. So purging and lustration, that seems to be more, well, they get to get clean. but it's not. It's clean from impurity. And I don't know why they didn't translate that and put it in the note, but maybe because if you think this fountain is just a miraculous opportunity for people now to cleanse themselves with water, no. This is a whole lot more. And again, we read about it in Ezekiel.
In that day too, declares God of hosts, I will erase the very names of the idols from the land. They shall not be uttered anymore. And I will also make the prophets and the impure spirit vanish from the land.
Yeah, and again, the Ruach Hatumah, which is they translate it as the impure spirits. It's the Tame, it's the Ruach Tame. How do they translate it in the King James, Mary? Yeah, the unclean spirit. It's bad spirits. Yeah, the note here says abnormal human behavior was attributed. Yeah, it's bad energy. It's bad mojo. It's the stuff that you get from worshiping idols. And that's why the word prophets is in quotation marks, because they're called Nevi'im, and they're not talking about good prophets. They're talking about people that were going around telling people to do bad stuff and worshiping other gods. So they're talking about people that were literally working as prophets for these other gods. And this bad energy, this bad force, if you will. I didn't want to use that word, but it's kind of what it's saying. There's a bad force and it's
Dark
gone.
side.
It's a dark side, yeah. And it's going to get, I wouldn't say abnormal behavior, but evil behavior. It's bad. That stuff is going to be gone. And what's interesting is the translation here is, yeah, it's a pretty good translation. What does it say instead of erase, Mary? Erase the names? Yeah, it kind of conveys this idea that they're not even going to know the names anymore. We're not even going to, people won't even remember the names of those gods, the Baals, the Ashtaroths, whatever. They won't even know them anymore. Not only are they not going to worship them, they're not even going to remember their names. They're gone. They're so gone that we don't even talk about them. We don't even remember their names. We forgot them. Or that we didn't know them. They're gone out of our minds. We don't know them. And look, that's what people would say. How do you really get rid of this idolatry? You don't even know their names. You don't even know what their names are. And that's what, to some extent, what the job of when you're trying to get rid of these religions, that's what you do, is you stop using the names. You get the names gone, which also means that people can't have those names in their names anymore, right? You don't want to see those names popping up anymore. So, Christianity tried to do it with a lot of, mythologies or pagan beliefs or whatever. They tried to wipe them out. And in some cases, they were pretty effective.
And in other cases, not so much.
Yeah, and sometimes they
Easter.
weren't. Sometimes like Easter or,
Or Yule.
Woden's Day or other many things that we still popped up into our lives, they didn't go away, which is kind of what American Gods is all about. But it's interesting that erasing the names is understood to be like the only way that we're really going to get rid of this is so that we don't even know that this stuff existed in this world. But again, did people have names that, did they have Baal in their names, or did they have, Hadad in their names? If they still had these gods in their names, how do you get rid of them? So, yeah, just can't have it. So the prophecies, the bad prophets, all of that stuff, got to get rid of it. And God's going to make it go by Yom Hahu in that day.
If some man prophesies thereafter, his own father and mother who brought him into the world will say to him, you shall die, for you have lied in the name of God. And his own father and mother who brought him into the world will put him to death when he prophesies.
Wow. So if you got a kid that's going around doing this craziness, you're going to turn them in. Pretty wild. It tells you that that happened. They didn't throw that out there as a hypothetical because it didn't happen. It happened. And they're telling people you're going to turn in your own kids if they do this. Wow.
Big lie has a long history.
Yeah. Oh, wait a second, folks. Look at this.
In that day, every such prophet will be ashamed of the visions he had when he prophesied. In order to deceive, he will not wear a hairy mantle, and he will declare, I am not a prophet, I am a tiller of the soil. You see, I was plied with the red stuff from my youth on.
Yeah, and that seems to be a weird phrase because again, what are they talking about? This Adom stuff. Does this go back to the Edomites, to the Esau, to a bad son who goes off the reservation, so to speak? What was going on with these people? Well, we're going to get them, and you're going to be turning them in. And they're not going to be anywhere for them to hide. And they're going to lie. They're going to try to blend in. They're going to try to pretend to not be the prophets for these gods anymore. And they're going to come up with lies to you and tell you that, well, I was only I was only doing this. I didn't really mean to do it. They're going to lie. And, this is what you got to do.
And if he is asked, what are those sores on your back? He will reply, from being beaten in the homes of my friends.
And this is a weird, and again, there's a couple notes here because sores are symptoms of hysteria, maybe, but as you can see, presumably for making drunken scenes. I don't know. The whole thing to me sounds kind of similar to the fact that people have already caught these guys. They've already been beaten. And what they seem to be doing is not telling people why they really got beaten, which is we were playing around. It was horse playing. I was at my friend's house and we were roughhousing. That's how I got all beaten up. Not, hey, I got caught. They beat me up. And that's why I'm all beaten up. So that's the way I interpret it, which is the guy's got beaten. He's got the scars. He's got the sores on his back, and he's telling people that's not how I got him. So I'm just telling you, this is not hypothetical. This is not like maybe this will happen. This must have really happened.
O sword, rouse yourself against my shepherd, the man in charge of my flock, says God of hosts. Strike down the shepherd and let the flock scatter. And I will also turn my hand against all the shepherd boys.
Yeah, so this goes back to the shepherd business, right? He's going back to the shepherds. Doesn't seem like he's talking about shepherds here, even though he says, I'm a tiller of the soil, which is not a shepherd, by the way. So it's not, this doesn't see, he's going back to this idea of bad shepherds, right? And those guys are going to be punished.
Throughout the land, declares God, 2/3 shall perish, shall die, and 1/3 of it shall survive. That third I will put into the fire, and I will smelt them as one smelts silver, and test them as one tests gold. They will invoke me by name, and I will respond to them. I will declare, you are my people, and they will declare, the eternal is our God.
So these last verses that, put in the same chapter, but this last part seems to begin with a poem to some extent, or a poem prophecy. O sword, rouse yourself against my shepherd, the man in charge of my flock. It seems as though, again, he's going back to this imagery of shepherds, of bad shepherds. And again, this last part here, 2/3 shall perish, shall die, and 1/3 will survive. This now uses a imagery of smithing, of melting gold through some kind of, again, this kind of purgatory situation where, you know, you purge out the bad stuff and, you know, for silver or gold, it says, as you smelt it, right? You know, you have to burn down the ore, and the good stuff comes out and the bad stuff you get rid of. Well, in some cases, you're burning a lot of rock and not getting a lot of good stuff out of it. And in this case, 2/3 is gone, is garbage, is done, is dead. Those are people they're talking about. So this is a really, really scary thing in the sense that it just kind of ended with the fact that only a fraction of the people are going to survive. And this is after the temple. This is not, there's no reason to believe. I mean, I guess some people would argue, but it doesn't make sense that he's talking about something that already happened. He's talking about something that's gonna happen. He wouldn't write a prophecy and say, hey, this is what just happened. That's not what a prophecy is. A prophecy is, this is what's happening and this is what's going to happen, which is that there's going to be another refinement, if you will. And that's the word we still use, a refinement of the people. That the good ones will be left. They'll be good. They'll be silver and gold. But there's a lot of other people that are going to be gone. So it's not, we don't really think that this is talking about what had happened 100 years, 75 years before, that this is still going to happen. Look, I mean, unfortunately, people have said this has happened throughout Jewish history, which is a remnant of a remnant of a remnant. You know, this is constantly being done to us, so that only a fraction of the people survive. What happens? The people that are left feel that they are, to some extent, lucky, but in some cases, they feel like the good way of looking at it is saying that the people who could survive, survived. It's not necessarily, I'm not saying we should look at it that way, but there are people who do look at it that way, that the people who are built for survival survive these kinds of things. It's the evolutionary theory of the Jewish people, which is that why do we succeed? Because the only people that could survive Jewish history were people who could adapt and who could make those decisions quickly, who could sense imminent destruction before most people could, and could be that much ahead of the next pogrom, the coming pogrom. They were already out. They heard, they saw, they picked up the signals, and they got out just in the nick of time. So what are we? We're the descendants of thousands of years of genetic, and not done by us. We didn't do it. They did it. They created a race of people that are essentially the ones that could survive. By the way, as some people have said, that doesn't make us nicer. It doesn't make us more kind or compassionate.
You know, I have a different take on it. I think it goes back to when we were discussing education. Right? I understand your theory, especially up to the show, right? I get that. And then going back to 1,000 years to the wars.
The people who survived the Holocaust that are still alive, that are in their 90s, I tell people all the time, it's not a coincidence. Those people could survive anything. The fact that they're still alive in their 90s is because these people had an amazing ability to survive things that other people can't survive.
Well, that would be an interesting
Yeah. Interesting. How much of our resilience is genetic and how much is cultural?
Yeah.
Hard to know.
yeah.
You can't do a double-blind study.
That's my point. That would be helpful.
But if you believe in genetics, if you believe in evolutionary theory, yes, but if you believe in evolutionary theory, how can you deny that that's what happened?
Well, everybody else who's alive now is also a descendant
There's
of
no
survivors.
question. Everybody who could survive the last ice age to some extent was able to survive. That was a genetic selector. But the fact that Jews were almost throughout history have had to survive constant, essentially, you better figure out how to survive
Well,
that adaptability. And that's what I say. Jews are not necessarily smarter than anybody. This isn't like we didn't genetically engineer smart people. What we did is we didn't genetically engineer, they genetically engineered people who are more adaptable.
that's. but-
That's,
But my theory is education, sorry to interrupt.
oh, go ahead.
Is, education, right? Because of education creates opportunity, opportunity creates resources, resources create choices. Right? And choices create survivability in many situations.
Well, there's another,
Except for you're herded like
yes.
goats.
Yeah, but that goes into what Rabbi was saying, 'cause if you're educated, you can be adaptable.
Listen,
You can
there's,
do things that-
there's another piece to this, which I didn't tell you, which is because Judaism never had a hereditary kingship, which creates
You say kin or king?
kingship. We didn't have
Not for long.
we didn't
anyway.
have a, look, I just want to tell you the theory, and I didn't make this theory up, folks. The theory is well established. Jewish people who succeeded in education, who were literate and who had a propensity to be able to understand things, were rewarded by having better marriages and being able to procreate at a higher level. So what happened is if a person succeeded in studies, as you're saying, and there was a component to this, John, that we did it by saying the people in the Jewish community who are smarter, who are going to do better, will have more children. Why? Because those people married their daughters off to people who were doing well educationally.
There's a theory.
Wait, I didn't say the second part, Rosemary.
All right.
What
sorry.
happened on the other side is that in Europe, at least, the same kids who showed a propensity for education or being able to be educated, being able to be literate, because they didn't have colleges and universities, the only places where you learned in those days was where? If you were not Jewish,
In the church,
in the church.
and they didn't
You
let you
became a
marry.
priest. So what did they do? They took their most intelligent people out of the gene pool.
Mm.
Now, that didn't mean that none of these priests ever had kids. We
They-
know that they did, but they weren't
They were
supposed,
Have to have
they
kids
weren't
anyway.
supposed to. They weren't supposed to. So yes, there was other genetic engineering that went on over the centuries that's in addition to this constant problem of, again, how do we survive? So yes, those factors that were both external and to some extent internal, I believe had an effect. You can't deny it. It's not, those same forces are not at play today. But on the other hand, people aren't having kids today. So it's difficult to say, well, the most successful Jews today are having thousands of kids. They're not. So that's not happening today. You can make the argument on the contrary, that in Israel, at least, the people who want to study in yeshiva, I don't necessarily know that they're the smartest people, but they're the ones that are having the most kids. We have a similar situation in this country where we're not rewarding necessarily the smartest people in this country by allowing them or encouraging them to have more kids. On the contrary, the smarter people tend to have less kids in this country. And I'm not going to get into the theories of why that happens, but it seems to be happening.
That, that was very, I kind of heard that discussion
Where?
you just mentioned. Did you said that Sam and Phil would have had daughters? I mean, sisters, sorry.
No, you can't control it anymore.
Oh, I can
Really? You can control, stop it. Stop right now. Really? Because your sons have
What can
already,
he control?
whether your kids have kids
No,
anymore.
no, had more children. Right?
John, I lost that argument. I was lucky to get a third. I made the argument. My wife she's too smart. She's too smart. Today, a smart woman is not going to say, I want to have 10 kids. They want to have a career, so they want to have a life. They want to be able to, so they're not, you can't do that anymore. It's not going to happen. There's no system in place for this to happen anymore. It's not going to happen anymore. I don't know what to tell you other than it won't happen.
As long as you keep it to 3 kids.
Yes.
That's above replacement.
You have 3 kids, but it was very hard. I wanted to have 5 to 7, and I was so not going to happen. That was so not going to happen. Yes, Rosemary,
I
sorry.
just wanted to add, there is a theory that when the rabbis mandated that you have to educate your children, that drove the Jews out of subsistence farming and forced them into occupations where they could utilize their education. Because the idea is that, okay, you're a subsistence farmer and you have to send your kids to school. That takes them out of the field and puts you at a disadvantage. And so those people, they either got a name, they either didn't educate their children and then they got a name as bad Jews and nobody wanted to marry them, or they converted.
Yeah, I think
There's
that,
a whole book about it.
I think that, yes, the problem with, I think that takes into consideration a fact that I don't think has ever really been true, which is that people paid attention to what the rabbis told them to do. So I think that overestimates how much power the rabbis had. I don't believe in human history, including back to what we're reading right now, I don't believe people ever listen to what people tell them to do as authority. They will do what they want to do and they will do what they can do. And to some extent, then there's the external stuff, which is they got killed, they died, their wife died in childbirth, all those other kinds of horrible things. And that just happened. And so I believe that the idea that people told them or mandated something, I don't buy that. I believe that people do what they want to do. They do what they can get away with. And to me, the external forces, when they were there, were enough to mess with what we would have done. By the way, I didn't say the downside of this, which is the downside is I think Jews are more neurotic than everyone else because you almost need to have paranoid neuroses to survive. The only way you can survive is if you have a higher probability, if you are the type of person who has more anxiety and more obsession with figuring out, do I have enough nuts stacked away so I can get out of here if I have to? That's not a good way to live all the time, folks. I just want to say the fact that we get rewarded for that in America is one of the reasons why we're so successful here, because we're rewarded for that kind of behavior. To have a country that allows us to do this and where we don't have to run around and go from place to place because today that king or that bishop decided today's the day we're rounding up Jews, that has allowed us to have tremendous success in this country because we're rewarded for our genetically pre-selected gifts. I don't talk about this a lot because there's no value to it. And again, it's just more to be aware of it. And who cares? At the end of the day, we are who we are. But I do believe there's an answer for why we are who we are. And I believe that both for the good and the bad of that, the bad side of it too, we have been genetically selected for this. And by the way, watching X-Men 97 just now on Disney, finishing up that series, made me realize that Marvel already told that story. So, and the fact that Magneto is actually Jewish and a survivor of the Holocaust pretty much told you that it's exactly what they want, exactly what the message that they wanted to tell you, which is that this is that Jews to some extent are the X-Men, but whatever. That's a whole nother midrash. All right, so we're going to read the last chapter of this Zechariah. The next week we will be in person again. We are reading the last 3 chapters of Malachi. We'll read that together in one day. It's actually probably going to be a shorter session because those 3 chapters aren't that long. We read 4 chapters today, but we are going to finish Malachi, and it doesn't make no sense to go into Psalms. But we're kind of looking at how we would end this out anyways. And it makes sense we're going to finish today. We might even finish a few minutes early, but we're going to read chapter 14. This is the last chapter of the second to last prophet, because then we're going to read Malachi, as I said, next week, the 3 chapters of Malachi. So here we go.
This was the one that, wow, I hit close to home last night when I was
Oh,
listening to it.
this is this last chapter there. Yes, we're going to dissect it.
Hold on to your hats.
Yep.
Lo, a day of God is coming when your spoil shall be divided in your very midst. For I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem for war. The city shall be captured, the houses plundered, and the women violated. And a part of the city shall go into exile. But the rest of the population shall not be uprooted from the city. Then God will come forth and make war on those nations as a fighter makes war on a day of battle.
Yeah, that first verse
Yeah.
hits a little close to home. Now,
Shivers.
again, it wasn't all the nations, right? It wasn't all the nations that gathered against
All the
us.
nations they knew about.
Yeah, but for us, if you
And a
think
lot
about
of those nations were backed by other nations.
correct, and so when we think about the fact that those nations that are on their side, the countries that were backing this, yeah, it's hard not to hear this part. Obviously, the house is plundered, the women violated, the women raped, and a part of the city will go into exile. It's very hard to hear that and not think about what happened on October 7th, right? So this is, I was talking to a Christian yesterday, actually, telling them, they were talking about how we're living at the end of days. And I said, listen, I don't know if we're living at the end of days, but there's definitely some repetition here. This is definitely there's definitely some stuff here. And I'm not sure if you knew what I was talking about with the end of Zechariah, but I said, yeah, the end of Zechariah, actually, we read just a couple weeks ago that Gaza will be destroyed. Gaza will be leveled. That is to some extent, a different prophecy, because that was a prophecy against the Philistines. But it's also a little strange to read that and see that coming again to fruition. But God will come forth and make war on those nations as a fighter makes war on a day of battle. So God is going to help us. You can imagine what's going to happen.
On that day, God's feet will stand on the Mount of Olives near Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall split across from east to west, and one part of the mount shall shift to the north and the other to the south, a huge gorge.
Yeah, well, that hasn't happened.
No.
And that hasn't happened, and it still hasn't happened. But yeah, I think I've spoken to other Christians who say that when this stuff happens, this is what we'll see. And the Mount of Olives is opposite the old city, right? We've been there many times. We've been to even in last trips to Israel that we made, we went to the Church of the Annunciation, which is there, the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was when he got taken by the Romans. That's all the Mount of Olives. And but the Mount of Olives here is going to get ripped in half, right?
It'll be messy. It's full of cemeteries.
Yeah, and exactly what Rosemary just said. The cemeteries that are there, including that huge Jewish cemetery on the Mount of Olives, which is, by the way, where Oskar Schindler is buried. It shows at the end of the Schindler's List, people, the survivors, the real survivors, walking and placing a stone on his tomb, on his memorial stone. That's he's one of the only Gentiles buried on the Mount of Olives because of what he did. But yeah, there's a lot of people that are going to be ripped apart, or maybe they're going to come out at that point. So this is big stuff.
And the valley in the hills shall be stopped up, for the valley of the hills shall reach only to Azal, It shall be stopped up as it was stopped up as a result of the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah of Judah. And the eternal my God with all the holy beings will come to you.
Yeah, so there was an earthquake. There was an earthquake in King Uzziah's day, back during when Isaiah lived, about 200 years before. There was an earthquake where catastrophic stuff happened in the area. But here's an interesting thing: the Kodashim will come to you, which they translated as the holy beings. What does your translation have there, Mary? The saints. Interesting. The holy ones, the holy things. That's what it says. The holy ones will be with you. Or the holies will be there. But it definitely seems to be would be like a capital H, some kind of angels maybe with them.
In that day, there shall be neither sunlight nor cold moonlight, but there shall be a continuous day. Only God knows when, of neither day nor night, and there shall be light at eventide.
That's interesting, right? That there's going to be a time when there will be no more day or night. There'll be an end to day and night time. So this seems to be a different world. I mean, one thing for the mountains to get ripped apart, there's not going to be nighttime anymore, which means that like our whole time system is gone. You won't be able to know a day. There will be no days anymore. So on that day, there will be a continuous day. V'haya yom echad. There'll be one day.
Is this the end of the day?
Seems like it. It seems like a day where there will be no more days like it afterwards. But it's interesting because look at what happens. There's an end to time as we know it. There'll be no more time as we know it. It doesn't say we're all going to heaven. It says there will be an end to time.
I mean, you could still measure time, because you see the sun go across.
No, there's not going to be any
Not gonna be-
sun going
there's not gonna be-
across anymore.
What was the sunlight? But then it says it'll be continuous light at eventide.
So it seems like the light is coming.
Let me see what it says.
Well, I'm thinking of what it's talking about in terms of, because there are a handful of stars in the night sky that are close to going supernova, and those types of supernovae, we wouldn't have a night anymore. Because their supernova would be bright enough to cast shadows and be a full daytime in the middle of the night.
That's an interesting idea.
So that's what I'm
Whether
thinking,
whether we'd still see.
wouldn't have recorded this because it was way later. 'Cause in 1060, the Crab Nebula exploded. The Chinese recorded it, and there were like 24 full days of no night. It was just so bright. Everyone was like, "Okay, I guess there's no more night anymore."
No, that's interesting. They definitely are telling you that there will be there won't be any darkness anymore. And it does seem to be an undoing of the first day of creation, right? Because when we see at the beginning, there's he or he, there's going to be day and there's going to be light. Now it says lo yom, there's no day, and there's below Lila. There's no day, there's no night. And there's going to be like, and then at the end it says Le'et Erev Yehi Or. So there's still light, which is interesting because again, that's the first thing that's created and it never stops. So the interesting thing about what happens in the world to come, if you will, is that it's light. There's just no more darkness. In a way, they could have just said, there's no more night, but they didn't say that. The way they described it is there'll be night, there'll be light in the Erev, which is, again, I don't-
describe it that way, 'cause doesn't night mark the day in the Jewish calendar?
to some extent, right? You don't,
Nighttime is what starts
you don't know time until you have the night, right? But in a way, it says there's not going to be a day. Lo yom, below Lila means there's no daytime, there's no nighttime. There's only light. So they've taken out the night. And so now there's still light, but there's no more day and night. There's no more daytime and there's no more nighttime. So there will be a day. Haya yom echad. There'll be one day. All of these things are interesting because the word yom keeps popping up. The next phrase too, by yom hahu, there's going to be a day. keep all that in mind because we've seen it already. I've already pointed out to you where Bayom HaHu comes up, but you're going to see another one, and you know this one. Yeah,
The last sentence in the eternal, my God, with all holy beings will come to you.
yeah,
Right? Okay, so we
Yeah.
say, all of us here. Okay, and the
Uh-huh.
next sentences there'll be no day or night or cold in the night. or, you know, the-
Yeah.
He is the word that ends with all.
okay, so yeah, there's no
We're all
more,
together in this one big pot,
and we're in Jerusalem.
wherever we are.
Yeah, we're in Jerusalem, right? Because it says right here, we're in
But
Jerusalem.
okay. But this is a prophecy,
I understand. So,
right? So it's 2024.
uh-huh,
The war and all.
maybe. So the war's over. Here, there's no more.
That's it. It's done.
Yeah.
Gone, gone,
The
gone,
war's,
gone,
the
another star.
okay, the war, okay, so the war's over. And now what happens? You're right. There's no more day, there's no more night, there's only light. And what else is there going to be?
In
Look at
that
this.
day, fresh water shall flow from Jerusalem, part of it to the eastern sea, and part to the western sea throughout the summer and winter. And God shall be sovereign over all the earth. In that day there shall be one God with one name.
So, yes. So what's going to happen on that day? It's also going to be special waters. A water will flow from Jerusalem, one going one direction out to the eastern sea, which is, as you can see, the Dead Sea. We already read about that, Prophet Joel. And that part of it's going out to the Mediterranean. So up on Jerusalem, there's going to be waters flowing both directions. Water, which is another thing that we read about in creation, right? On the second day, we have the separation of waters. Now we have waters feeding both sides of the land of Israel coming out of Jerusalem. So up on the top of the mountain, at the top of the Judean mountains, there's water coming out there, and that's now flowing both directions. That is a tremendous miracle because Jerusalem has some springs, but they don't have enough springs to create rivers flowing down to both sides through the country. So here you have the Dead Sea going to be flowing with water from Jerusalem. And there is water that comes off the hills, but not like this. This is fresh water coming out that's going to come out. And it's not just water, right? What's the translation, Mary, for in verse 8 for the water? What does it say? Yeah, it's Mayim Chaim, which is a beautiful way of saying living water, which we would understand as rivers or fresh water, waters that have life, but the waters of life. So again, fresh water is not a bad translation, but the real beautiful translation of it is living waters will flow from Jerusalem, which is, again, both spiritual and from the environmental standpoint, there's water flowing from Jerusalem. What's interesting, by the way, is we're talking actually right now, Israel's talking about having water flowing into the Dead Sea from the Mediterranean through channels and through pumping that will raise the level back up of the Dead Sea. The reason they haven't done it yet is because they're hesitant to destroy the ecological situation, the balance of the water that is in the Dead Sea. If you pump in water, even if it's more salinated, because it's coming from the Mediterranean than it is fresh water. I mean, this would destroy the Dead Sea. Fresh water coming in from Jerusalem would eventually destroy the Dead Sea, would turn it into living water, which in our world today, we'd say, oh, you can't do that. You can't disturb the ecological balance of the Dead Sea. But they're looking at it as, here's a sea filled with dead nothing. There's no fish there. Even back in those days when they did have, we know they had ships there. We found, that there were ships in the Dead Sea. Even if it was not as salinated, even if it was not as highly, almost, I think the water's toxic there. I don't like going in that water.
No,
But
it's-
people do it, and you have to do it, but I really don't like doing it. It doesn't make me feel good. But if you like it and you're like, oh, well, this is a special kind of stuff, which they do. They sell that salt and they sell those minerals. This would destroy that. But they also are looking at it from the standpoint of, but it's life, right? Let's turn that water into life. So there's not going to be, again, to some extent, it's not a seasonal thing either. It's always flowing. It's not a seasonal, well, there's a runoff or something. It's always flowing. And then we have this very, 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 very famous line that we say all the time. V'haya Adonai lemelech o kol haaretz bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad. Shemo u'shemo echad. The end of the Alenu, folks. Zechariah chapter 14:9. That Bayom Hahu made it in. And what we love about this Bayom Hahu, right? Bayom Hahu, on that day, there will be one God with one name. God will be one. And this idea that beyond the things of, wars coming to an end, time coming to an end, God will be one. There'll be one sense of humanity. And in that way, the world will be brought together. The world will be brought together with this idea that there's one God and there's only one God. And to some extent, his name is one. So you almost wonder if you read this in its like original context, does God have a new name? Does God have a name one? Do we stop using the word Adonai and do we start calling God one? We start using the name Echad because it says Ushemo Echad. Now we said, and his name is one. Now we understand that is he's only going to be called by one name, which is Adonai. Because it says, and this is a bad translation, and God shall be sovereign on all the earth. The translation of the King James, Mary, is what? Yeah, but what does it say? V'haya at the very beginning. Yeah, the Lord. That's the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh name. That's God's name. So it says in here, Adonai will be the king over all the earth. And on that day, the Lord will be one and his name will be one. Now, is it that there's only one God, that everyone recognizes that there's only one God, and his name is only that one name, Adonai? Everyone calls him Adonai. Everyone calls him the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh name, which is why, by the way, the reason that Jehovah's Witnesses are so keen on calling him Jehovah. We got to call him that because that's what Zechariah says. Everyone's going to use that name. We got to start using that name. Of course we don't. And we know it's not Jehovah, which is why I can say it without ever fearing that I'm using God's name in vain. But whatever it is, that God will only be known by one name. There will only be one God. Now, what's interesting about that is that one can make the argument that we are closer to this than we ever have been in human history. Now, of course, what needed to happen for that to happen is we had to essentially wipe out every form of paganism that existed, every form of multiple polytheistic religions that needed to be wiped out. Now, in all fairness, 99% of that work was done by Christians and Muslims. I want to say that we had very little to do with that. Aside from the Idumeans that we wiped out their gods, and I guess the Canaanites that we seem to have not even been that good at wiping out their gods because we were worshiping their gods. But for the most part, the only thing we know about as Jews that we wiped out was forcibly converting some Idumeans. And again, it seems like kind of forcing these people like the Canaanites and the Philistines to eventually come over to our God. What? So the Hindus and Buddhists, right? So who's done that work? Well, the Muslims are definitely doing that work. They did that work in India for a long time and are still doing that work to some extent, as some Hindus would say. Hindus are fighting back. The BJP that's in power now, Modi's party, has done a very effective job of fighting back against Islam. That's his thing.
Apparently, like Jews and Hindus get along really well. Like we have
Jews and Hindus who are at war with Islam. The Hindus that are, hey, they're our brothers, they're our whatever. The Hindus that were in power over India for the last 70 years or 65 years were not so pro-Israel. The Congress Party that was led by Nehru and those people were not pro-Israel. They generally were actually fairly anti-Israel because they wanted to be part of that non-aligned group of people that were not too Western and not too communist, but who were to some extent would play both sides against each other. But the non-allied nations, Pakistan was on our side, was on the US's side. Whereas, again, India was kind of hewed a little bit closer to the Soviet Union for a long time.
In terms of like ethnic struggles,
Yes.
there's very few Hindus who actually like want us dead. They
So,
just sort of are happy to leave us alone and we're happy to leave them.
yes,
alone.
for thousands of years, Jews have lived in Hindu territories, Hindu lands, unprovoked, unmolested, unattacked, have done very well. And they did very well in India for most of the time. They were left alone by Hindus. The weird thing is that, yes, the BJP, Modi and the Israelis have had much better relationships because they both are worried about Islamic terror, right? So they are unified by that. The irony, of course, is that from the standpoint of monotheism, the Muslims are closer to us monotheistically than the Hindus are. From a practical standpoint, they're definitely allies right now. But India has their own agenda, right? And India is right now the biggest purchaser of Russian oil and are essentially, to some extent, Russia is being propped up by China and India right now. And that's why this war in Ukraine can continue. It's because India is buying their oil. So look, it's not like so free of saying, hey, India's our ally now, or they're on the same page as us. But they're now the most populous nation in the world. They've passed China for population. And so they're an important country for us to think about. But yes, they're not a Jewish country. They're not a monotheistic country. They're not a country that this is happening. But yeah, in many parts of the world, monotheism has won out the day, if you will. And even again, many Hindus will tell you that there's a kind of monotheistic idea behind it, which is that's what Sikhism was tried to do, was tried to blend some of the monotheistic, more Muslim ideas with Hinduism. Sikhism has not prevailed in India, but there's chunks of India that are Sikh. But yeah, I don't know what the future holds, but the idea that there's one God that unites the world is our vision. That's what we've been talking about for 2,500 years. And Zechariah just told you what the vision is. The vision is that God will be one, and that's the one in charge. God is the one in charge. Not really, like, you didn't see anything here about King David. There was nothing here about that. Let's finish this up and you'll see what is part of this final vision of peace.
Then the whole country shall become like the Arabah, from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. The latter, however, shall perch high up where it is, and shall be inhabited from the gate of Benjamin to the site of the old gate, down to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. Never again shall destruction be decreed, and Jerusalem shall dwell secure. As for those people that warred against Jerusalem, God will smite them with this plague. Their flesh shall rot away while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall rot away in their sockets, and their tongues shall rot away in their mouths.
Yeah, that's kind of a gruesome image. This is what's going to happen to the people that went to war against us.
There's one weapon that'll do it.
Yep.
In that day, a great panic from God shall fall upon them, and everyone shall snatch at the hand of another, and everyone shall raise their hand against everyone else's hand. Judah shall join the fighting in Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the nations round about. Vast quantities of gold, silver, and clothing shall be gathered in. The same plague shall strike the horses, the mules, the camels, and the donkeys. The plague shall affect all the animals in those camps.
Yep. So even the animals are going to be affected by this final plague.
All who survive of all those nations that came up against Jerusalem shall make a pilgrimage year by year to bow low to the supreme God of hosts and to observe the Feast of Booths. Any of the earth's communities that does not make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to bow low to the supreme God of hosts shall receive no rain. However, if the community of Egypt does not make this pilgrimage, it shall not be visited by the same affliction with which God will strike the other nations that do not come up to observe the Feast of Booths. Such shall be the punishment of Egypt and of all other nations that do not come up to observe the Feast of Booths. In that day, even the bells on the horses shall be inscribed, Holy to God. The metal pots in the house of God shall be like the basins before the altar. Indeed, every metal pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holy to God of hosts. And all those who sacrifice shall come and take of these to boil their sacrificial meat in. In that day, there shall be no more traitors in the house of God of hosts.
And that's the way the prophecy ends. So everyone's going to come up to Jerusalem on Sukkot. Hag Sukkot. Every Sukkot, people around the world better get up there. And if they don't, they're not going to have rain. If not, they're done. So everyone in the world is essentially, now you thought they just have to recognize God. Well, they have to come up and offer up a sacrifice at Sukkot. Everyone's going to be doing it. And what's interesting about it is that they're going to be bringing in their pots, and every pot is going to be filled with sacrificial meat because everyone's going to be doing their sacrifices. And Sukkot is the holiday of dedicating the temple. It's the reason that the Maccabees made an 8-day holiday in the wintertime when they rededicated the temple. It wasn't because the candles, the light of the menorah lasted 8 days. It's because they wanted a Sukkot when they dedicated the temple. They said so. They said that. It was the rabbis who said that the light.
That they weren't around for the actual Sukkot holiday or something.
Yeah, they couldn't fight. The Maccabees couldn't celebrate Sukkot. The temple had been violated during that Sukkot. And so they made a Sukkot. They made a Sukkot when they rededicated the temple. And they said that's why Sukkot was then. And they said that's why their holiday was Hanukkah, the dedication of the temple. So because they knew Zechariah. And we already talked about how the menorah was so important for the Maccabees. It's why we read Zechariah during Hanukkah. The rabbis prescribed for us to read it. Even though the rabbis didn't want us to know really the story of Hanukkah, they did provide the clues. If it hadn't been for the book of Maccabees that the Christians kept, we wouldn't have known it, but they gave us little clues. And one of the clues is Zechariah. This idea that everyone's going to celebrate Sukkot one day. The Maccabees knew what they did. They did what they did for a reason. Sukkot is their holiday. It's our holiday today to some extent, which is supposed to be important, but it's an important holiday of one day for the entire world. The entire world is going to celebrate Sukkot. By the way, did they think that maybe their Sukkot, that their Hanukkah Sukkot was going to be the new Sukkot? Maybe. But they knew what they were doing. They knew they were playing with Sukkot. They knew what they were doing. Sukkot was when Solomon dedicated the temple. The very first holiday that was ever celebrated in the temple in Jerusalem was Sukkot. And they knew that. And these people knew it. And the Christians knew it. And everybody knows what Zechariah is talking about, which is that everyone in the world was supposed to be doing it. And what was the very famous scene that we have from Jesus' life when he enters the temple? What does he do? He overturns the traitors, right? He goes into the temple and he overturns their tables. Why? Because he was doing this. He didn't say, I'm doing it because everybody knew Zechariah. John, everybody, back to this point, everyone knew the story that the traitors were there. Why are they there? They're not there because they're there for a reason, right? They're there to change money so that the people who come from other countries can make their offerings. That's what they're talking about here. But what's different is in that day, everyone's going to be using the shekel. There's no need for traders anymore because they all are worshiping God all the time. And any of the money that they have is the money that they need. There's no need for it anymore.
They don't have illegal money that has images on it.
Yeah,
You know,
100%.
my thought. Dark. Because the war event of all wars ends, and whoever is surviving. This is, it sounds a little silly, but I'm very serious. It is a bit of Mad Max, right? There's nothing left. And so they're coming to Sukkot because they need rain because the weather patterns have been changed. Right? There's nothing left. There's only the people left that were lucky enough to be in the far ends of the earth that survived whatever happened. And that's why people, the very wealthy, are seeking out places like New Zealand and those things.
There's no doubt.
That's
So here's the interest. I hear what you're saying. That's a great idea. It's not a great idea. It's a horrible idea. It's a horrible idea, but it's an interesting thought. Yes, New Zealand would be a really smart place to go when the world ends. There was actually a book written a long time ago called The Beach, right? It's On the Beach, right? Is that the science fiction book where Australia is the last place where humanity is living after the nuclear war? I think it was called On the Beach. Somebody help me out with that. Anyways, what is weird though, John, is the one place that you wouldn't think you want to be at the end of the world. The only place that's going to survive is Jerusalem. You're thinking that's the first place that's going to blow up. Because in our mind, we know what weapons will do. And the weapon that you were thinking of, right, that's going to be doing that is a nuclear weapon. And you'd think that the nuclear weapon is going to be going right to that place.
It may not destroy the walls, right? It'll destroy the wood, it'll destroy, it'll melt the metals, but it
Yeah.
may not destroy the walls.
Yes, but I know, but look, no, most people haven't, but the description of what happens at the end when these people literally have their bodies melt away,
Come on.
that is pretty scary. But then again, we also are developing biological weapons that will do the same thing, right? Yeah, it's called On the Beach, folks. They made a movie of it, right? So this was the book. It came out in 1957. The novel details the experiences of a mixed group of people in Melbourne as they're waiting the daily radiation spreading across them from the northern hemisphere following nuclear war. So yeah, that's what it was. So they made a movie of it. But yeah, I mean, I used to love apocalyptic novels when there weren't that many of them. Now there's too many to keep up with. I can't keep up with all your zombie stuff. All your
They're too true.
whatever. But there's so many of them.
Too
But
much dystopia.
I know, but I am looking forward towards Furiosa when that comes out. I'm looking forward to that. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, that dude George Miller is so good. I mean, the last Mad Max movie was one of the best movies in the last 10 years. But yes, I've always been fascinated by this kind of stuff. I really, I've always been fascinated by, but there used to not be many of them. And the people that wrote them, it was a very special genre of science fiction. One of my favorites, well, was actually written by a different Miller, but it was my favorite. Now there's so many, but I always loved it. I always loved the title of this one. Oh, that's my pictures. That's not it. Here it is, right here. You ever see this one? Rosemary, you probably read this book.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's a good one.
A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is a very interesting idea. It came out about the same time as On the Beach. It's a Catholic monastery in the southwestern United States, like near Arizona, New Mexico. After nuclear war, the book spans thousands of years as civilization tries to rebuild itself. So the concept is that it's really an interesting idea because it's kind of like, well, you assume that like history has done this before, but Isaac Edward Leibowitz, a Jewish electrical engineer working in the United States, survived the war and sought refuge. And basically his letters, his writings became the basis for a new religious order. And that's how, yeah. It's interesting because I don't think they've ever even tried to make a movie of this. Help me out here. I don't think they've ever, have you ever seen it,
No, I don't think so.
Rosemary? I don't think we've ever seen even an attempt to do this. It's too weird.
It's too episodic.
Yeah, it's too it's
You
too.
could maybe make a mini series of
It,
it,
here's
but
an
it's also very
adaptation.
cerebral, I
Here's it
think.
says they did a BBC Radio. You figure that, right?
might-
BBC Radio would do it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, it's a little too, intellectual. It's not what most post-apocalyptic fiction is,
Not
which is,
not enough exploding.
yeah, there's not enough chasing and stuff like that. So yes, it's more about like probably how humanity would regenerate itself. So anyways,
There's
um,
another book that's great, it's called
Lucifer's Hammer,
Yes. Yes, that's
should-
good.
which is that one? I don't remember that one.
That's Larry Niven, I think.
This is actually entertainment to you people?
It's,
Yes.
it's it's always, it's been it's
It's not about nuclear war, but it's.
But it's about it,
oh,
that's
I remember this. Yeah, there's Larry Niven.
right.
Yeah, this is another guy. I just had a discussion with somebody about Harlan Ellison, one of the great writers of science fiction, speculative science fiction, who was actually Jewish, by the way, a guy from Cleveland. He only died a couple years ago. But yeah, no, this is interesting stuff, John, because it makes you think about like, how would humanity deal with these kinds of things? So what do we
You know
do?
what it's gonna be? It's
What?
total chaos. That's what it's gonna be. Because if anybody's ever been in
I
a
don't know.
difficult situation.
Yeah.
In a car accident, in a war, in a fight, it's chaos. So all this pre-scripted crap.
It's not prescriptive.
it's all-
That's,
it's
but
all-
the,
it's
but
all
the,
false.
but the
That's
idea.
why you practice,
the-
John. If you go down
See,
to
now,
the
now,
basic level
now,
of
now
reading,
we're having a philosophical discussion about what you actually need to do. But I,
Well,
Buy munitions when they're on sale, stock water and.
Well, John,
open the door,
John,
hope it takes you.
John, here's the interesting thing. Are the Jewish people today, are we equipped to survive? Because the interesting thing is that we were always the ones who had to figure out how to survive, right? We're speculating that the next time this happens, it's going to be on a global scale. That's what Zechariah is talking about. He's talking about it's a global scale, or at least a Mediterranean wild scale. But it seems like it's a global scale. If day and night are over, everyone's affected by that. So we assume that. The question is, can Jews survive when everyone is being like that? Or is our thing, well, we can survive when we're the only ones being chased, but when humanity is under that, how do we do?
survived
What do you
the
think?
collapse of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, we did.
That's not the same.
Yeah, we did. We did survive that. Rosemary's right. We
Watch the Bronze Age collapse.
so you don't think, I did watch it. So you like that? What was it called? The Day After Tomorrow, or no?
Chaos.
What was it called? Wasn't The Day After Tomorrow, it
That's another
was,
The day after
the
tomorrow
one-
was another disaster.
I know, but that wasn't that was the one about nuclear war. No, this one was, the Julia Roberts one that just came out on Netflix was called whatever, but it was pretty good. It was pretty good. It was pretty well done. It was interesting, speculative, but also a little humorous. But yeah, there's an interesting question of whether we would do well with the whole world going into chaos. I'm not so sure. I don't think we do as well.
maybe not as insular as we used to be, and there's good to that, but also bad.
Yeah, but I think we tend to now not focus on those kinds of skills that, like, I don't know that, like, would Jews figure out how to grow vegetables on the top of a,
Well, we were
tower.
always, that's the theory I was talking about. We let other people grow the vegetables, and our job was to get vegetables from A to B.
I know, I just wonder if the real collapse happens, if what we're talking about really happened, would we have the skills to,
Well, we lost a lot of Jews when it did happen, but
I
we didn't
know.
lose them all.
I know. And do we know how many of us know how to be equipped for, battle? Anyways, it's a weird thing to think about, but the idea that Jerusalem will be the place that we're all going to be saved in,
That is-
that seems unbelievable. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's the one place where the cure for the plague is. Don't forget, in World War Z, that's where Brad Pitt went to learn how the Israelis survived the zombie. How do they know about the zombie
It's a funny
apocalypse?
logic. I was talking to some Christian friends about that, and he's like, yeah, probably living in Jerusalem would be safe because Iran, as a Muslim nation, wouldn't want to bomb Jerusalem because the Dome of the Rock is just there. They don't want
That's-
to blow that up.
Probably one of the hosts, though some of those missiles that came, those drones, we're going to be going to Jerusalem according to Israel. Some of them were-
If you're a fanatic enough, you believe that God is going to save your place, no matter what you do to it, so.
Well, I don't know, but there is something to be said for the Dome of the Rock being there, right?
Yeah.
Especially for Muslims who, you know, like
Revered.
Shiite Muslims who, I mean, they do believe in Mecca and Medina being very holy, but they're not as into that as obviously the Saudis are. Saudis are not going to let Mecca and Medina go down. But yeah, interesting thing to think about, this idea that we have back to Zechariah. To some extent, I wish Zechariah was the last book of the prophets. Malachi, what we're going to read next week, is also talking about the end of days, but he's a lot less descriptive and a lot less focused on like the details of what happens to Jerusalem. But he is definitely talking about those days. We talked about it. I actually showed you a little bit of it before when we talked about it before Passover, because we read his text every year right before Passover, Malachi, and actually, I just saw his words on a building that I'll show you next week when we read it. But yeah, next week is Malachi and the end of the prophets. So take care, everybody. Have a good week. We're going to have Wednesday class tomorrow night. We'll be in person and on Zoom. And we will see you soon, everybody. Take care.
Bye, everybody.